A Werewolf Shifter Romance, written by Amelia Hart. Chapter 1. Fallen Luna. 3 years. That's how long it had been since Vera Nightfall learned that love could be the cruelest betrayal of all. The memory still burned like acid in her veins, as vivid now as the day it happened. She could still see Garrett's cold amber eyes as he stood before the gathered Silver Moon pack, his voice carrying across the ceremonial clearing with devastating clarity. I, Alpha Garrett Silvermoon, reject you, Vera Nightfall, as my Luna and mate. The gasps from the pack had been audible. Luna rejections were rare, public ones almost unheard of. For 2 years she had been beloved by the Silver Moon wolves. She'd organized their festivals, mediated their disputes, cared for their children as if they were her own. They'd called her the Golden Luna, not just for her unusual blonde hair, but for the way she seemed to bring light wherever she went. But the rejection hadn't been the worst part. No, the worst part had been the 3 years leading up to that moment, when she'd started having the episodes that would ultimately seal her fate. It began innocuously enough. Dreams that felt too real, visions of ancient wolves with golden eyes and silver crowns running through forests that no longer existed. She'd wake with the taste of moonlight on her tongue, and strange words in languages she'd never learned echoing in her mind. Then came the moments during pack meetings when her vision would shift, and she could see threads of light connecting every wolf present. Golden threads that pulsed with emotion, silver ones that carried thoughts, deep red ones that revealed hidden fears and desires. During heated discussions, she found herself knowing exactly what each pack member was thinking, feeling their emotions as if they were her own. The first time it happened, she'd blurted out a solution to a territorial dispute that addressed concerns no one had voiced aloud. The room had fallen silent, dozens of eyes staring at her with a mixture of awe and unease. Garrett had called it fascinating at first. My powerful Luna, he'd whisper in the dark, tracing the pulse at her throat where her mark should have been. There's something special about you. Something that makes you different from other she-wolves. But different had quickly become dangerous in his mind, especially after the pack elders began their whispered conversations. Old Margaret had been the first to voice what everyone was thinking. That girl's got the sight, she'd muttered during a healing session, her gnarled fingers trembling as she pointed at Vera. Haven't seen abilities like that since my grandmother told stories of the royal bloodlines. The pack elders had spoken of powers that hadn't been seen for centuries, abilities that could challenge the current order of alpha dominance. They remembered stories of the first alpha kings who ruled not through brute force, but through an almost mystical understanding of their people, leaders who could sense deception, who knew their pack's needs before they were spoken, who commanded loyalty through wisdom rather than intimidation. And Vera had been manifesting those exact abilities. The breaking point came during her pregnancy. As her body changed, so did her powers. The episodes became stronger, more frequent. She could feel every wolf in the territory, their emotional states, their loyalty levels, their hidden resentments. It was overwhelming and terrifying, like having the emotional weight of hundreds of lives pressing down on her mind. But it was also intoxicating. For brief moments, she felt connected to something vast and ancient, a legacy that stretched back to the very first wolves who walked upright under the moon. Garrett's fear had grown with each passing day. She'd caught him in hushed conversations with his sister Isadora, their voices cutting off whenever she entered the room. The way they looked at her changed, no longer with love and respect, but with calculation and growing dread. Some bloodlines are too dangerous to continue, she'd overheard Isadora say one night. The old royal families were eliminated for good reason. Do you want her to wake up one day and decide she outranks you? The rejection ceremony had been a masterpiece of political theater. Garrett had accused her of being unstable and potentially dangerous to pack unity. He'd cited her episodes as evidence of mental breakdown, painting her abilities as delusions of grandeur rather than manifestations of ancient power. But the cruelest blow had come from Isadora, who'd approached her with apparent sisterly concern just before the ceremony. Here, she'd said, offering a steaming cup of tea. This will help with your nerves. The liquid had tasted bitter, wrong, but Vera had been too emotionally shattered to recognize the danger. The suppressor potion had hit her system like liquid fire, severing not only the forced rejection bond, but also blocking her emerging abilities. The shock had been so severe that she'd miscarried that very night, losing both her mate and her child in one devastating blow. Vera had fled in the darkness, broken and powerless, believing she had nothing left to live for. The bounty hunters had come within days, warriors paid to bring back the unstable former Luna for her own protection, they claimed. That's when Tormund had found her. The grizzled ex-warrior had discovered her collapsed in a snowbank 3 days into her flight, nearly dead from exposure and grief. Instead of claiming the substantial reward Garrett had offered, Tormund had done something that changed everything. He'd recognized what she truly was. Royal blood, he'd said simply, his scarred face grave as he carried her to his hidden cabin. Haven't seen the signs in 60 years, but I know them. Your bastard of an ex-mate tried to suppress it, but you can't cage a wolf forever. For 3 years, Tormund had been her salvation and her teacher. The old warrior had lived through the transition period when the last royal bloodlines had supposedly died out. Eliminated by ambitious alphas who preferred ruling through fear rather than earning loyalty through wisdom, the first alpha kings could read hearts and minds, he'd explained during one of their brutal training sessions, his wooden practice sword leaving fresh bruises on her arms. They could sense truth from lies, feel the strength and weakness of every wolf in their territory. That's real leadership, girl, not the brute force dominance these modern alphas rely on. Under his guidance, she'd learned to channel her rage into something useful. Combat training that pushed her body to its limits, mental exercises that taught her to shield her thoughts, political lessons about pack dynamics and territorial law. More importantly, he'd helped her understand that the suppressor potion's effects would eventually fade, that her abilities were dormant, not destroyed. She'd become the Ghost Wolf, a mercenary who took contracts throughout the neutral territories, eliminating rogue threats, rescuing kidnapped pack members, settling disputes that official channels couldn't touch. Her reputation had grown with each successful mission. A phantom who appeared like mist, completed impossible tasks, and vanished without leaving a trace. But 2 months ago, Tormund had died protecting her from Garrett's latest attempt to reclaim his property. The old warrior had taken 3 silver arrows meant for her, smiling even as the light faded from his pale blue eyes. "You're ready now," he'd whispered, his calloused hand gripping hers with the last of his strength. "Find Cain Stormcrest in the northern mountains. He's the only one strong enough to help you take back what's yours." Now, crouched in the underbrush at the edge of Stormcrest territory, Vera felt those words echoing in her mind. The rogue cell she'd eliminated an hour ago lay scattered in the clearing behind her. 5 wolves who'd been terrorizing human settlements, taking livestock and threatening children. Their threat to the innocent was permanently ended, but the fight had left her with a deep gash across her ribs and a smaller cut on her temple. Perfect injuries for her purposes. This wasn't desperation driving her across the heavily defended border. This was calculated strategy, the culmination of months of planning. Cain Stormcrest's reputation preceded him throughout the northern territories. The most feared alpha in 3 generations, they said. Ruthless in battle, impossible to intimidate, with a tactical mind that had never lost a war. His pack controlled the largest territory in the north, a harsh mountainous region that bred the strongest warriors. But more importantly, he was rumored to be the only alpha who still respected the old codes, the ancient laws that men like Garrett had abandoned for expedience and personal gain. If anyone could teach her the final skills she needed, the political maneuvering, the pack dynamics, the subtle art of alpha warfare, it would be him. Vera pressed her hand against the injury on her ribs, ensuring fresh blood marked her shirt. The metallic scent would carry on the wind, announcing her presence to any patrol wolves in the area. She needed to look like a threat, but also like someone who had just proved her worth in battle. The dead rogues behind her would speak to her capabilities. The injuries would show she wasn't invincible. The perfect combination of strength and vulnerability to intrigue a tactical mind like Stormcrest's. She stepped across the invisible border that marked his territory, immediately feeling the shift in the air. This land was different, older, wilder, charged with the kind of primal power that made her suppressed wolf whine with recognition. The very trees seemed to pulse with ancient magic, and she could sense eyes watching her from the shadows. Somewhere in these unforgiving mountains was the alpha who might be her salvation or her destruction. Either way, Vera Nightfall was done running from her destiny. It was time to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her. The hunt for justice was about to begin. Chapter 2. Testing Boundaries. The scent of blood and battle reached Kane's Stormcrest before he saw the intruder. He'd been conducting a perimeter sweep when his patrol wolves had reported the disturbance. Rogue activity near the southern border, followed by an unidentified she-wolf crossing into his territory. What they hadn't mentioned was the strange pull he felt the moment her scent hit the wind. It wasn't a mate bond. Kane had long since accepted that the moon goddess had other plans for him, and at 32, he'd made peace with ruling alone. This was something different, something that made his wolf pace restlessly beneath his skin, something that whispered of old magic and forgotten bloodlines. He found her sitting against a massive pine tree, methodically cleaning a deep gash across her ribs with torn fabric from her shirt. Her blonde hair was matted with dirt and blood. Her clothes bore the marks of recent combat, but her movements were precise, controlled, professional. This was no ordinary rogue. "You're trespassing," he said, stepping out of the tree line with deliberate casualness. Alpha power radiated from him in waves, a presence that typically sent even experienced wolves to their knees. She looked up without flinching, pale blue eyes meeting his with steady calculation. "I'm aware." Her voice carried a refined accent that spoke of education and high breeding, completely at odds with her current disheveled state. More intriguingly, while his alpha presence pressed against her like a physical weight, she remained upright, unfazed. Impossible. Even other alphas felt the pressure of his dominance. "The rogue pack terrorizing the human settlement to the south," she continued, securing a makeshift bandage around her torso. "They won't be troubling anyone anymore." Kane's eyes narrowed. His scouts had been tracking that particular group for weeks, waiting for the right moment to eliminate them, without risking civilian casualties. "You took on 5 rogues alone?" 6, actually. She stood with fluid grace despite her injuries. "The last one tried to run." The casual way she said it sent a chill down his spine. This woman had single-handedly eliminated a threat that would have required a full assault team from his warriors. Either she was lying, or she was far more dangerous than she appeared. His wolf stirred with recognition, sensing something familiar yet impossible to place. Ancient. Royal. "What's your name?" The question came out as an alpha command, backed with enough power to compel truth from even the strongest-willed wolves. "Vera Nightfall." Her response came without hesitation, but something flickered in her eyes, surprise at her own compliance, as if she'd expected to resist but found herself answering anyway. Nightfall. The name tugged at memories from his childhood, stories his grandmother had told about the old royal lines. But those bloodlines had died out generations ago, eliminated during the Great Purge when ambitious alphas had systematically destroyed anyone who might challenge their authority. "And what brings Vera Nightfall to my territory, bleeding and alone?" This time she resisted his command completely. Her chin lifted in defiance, pale eyes flashing with inner fire. "That's my business." Fascinating. The resistance wasn't complete. She'd answered his first question despite herself, but her mental defenses were unlike anything he'd encountered. They felt ancient, layered with techniques that predated modern pack training. "Everything that happens in my territory is my business," he replied, letting his voice drop to the low growl that made seasoned warriors tremble. "You've eliminated a threat to the humans under my protection, which I appreciate, but you've also crossed my borders without permission and refused to explain yourself. That presents a problem." Vera stepped away from the tree, and despite her injuries, her posture screamed predator rather than prey. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I came looking for you specifically, Alpha Stormcrest." "Did you now?" He circled her slowly, noting the way she tracked his movement with the focused attention of a trained fighter. "And why would a lone rogue seek out the most dangerous alpha in the Northern Territories? Because you have a reputation for honoring the old ways, for understanding that strength isn't just about who can hit the hardest." The words hit him like a physical blow. Few wolves even remembered the old codes anymore. The ancient laws that had governed their kind before, might makes right, became the only rule that mattered. "You know about the old ways? I was taught by someone who lived through the transition. Someone who remembered when leaders earned loyalty rather than demanded it." Her words carried weight, history, and a pain that resonated with his own experiences. Cain had inherited a pack on the brink of destruction, scattered and demoralized after years of weak leadership. He'd rebuilt them using principles most modern alphas had forgotten: honor, strategy, protection of the innocent. "This teacher of yours," he said carefully, "does he have a name?" Grief flashed across her features. Tormund Greyback. "He died 2 months ago." Cain went very still. Every wolf in the Northern Territories knew that name, even if they'd never met the man himself. Tormund Greyback had been a legend, a warrior from the old guard who'd served the last legitimate Alpha King before the bloodlines fell. "Tormund trained you for 3 years." Her voice was steady, but he caught the underlying current of loss. "He said you were the only Alpha left who might understand what I'm trying to accomplish. Which is..." Instead of answering directly, she began to change. Not the violent explosion of bone and sinew that most wolves underwent, but a fluid transformation that spoke of perfect control. Her wolf was smaller than his would be, but built for speed and precision. White-gray fur with unusual silver markings around her eyes and throat. Markings that made his breath catch in his throat. He'd seen those markings in ancient texts, carved into the stones of ruined temples. They were the physical signs of royal bloodline. Genetic markers that appeared only in wolves descended from the original Alpha Kings. His own transformation was swift and brutal, bones crackling as his massive black wolf emerged. At nearly twice her size, with silver eyes that glowed like moonlight, he was a creature built for war and dominance. But when they circled each other in the clearing, something extraordinary happened. Instead of submitting to his obvious physical superiority, her wolf met his gaze with calm confidence. She was acknowledging his power without being crushed by it, a balance that shouldn't have been possible. The spar that followed was unlike anything he'd experienced. She was fast, incredibly so, using his size against him with techniques that were clearly professional military training. But more than that, she seemed to anticipate his moves, flowing out of the way of attacks that should have connected. When his jaws snapped toward her throat in a dominance display, she twisted away and countered with precision strikes to his legs and flanks. Not trying to seriously injure, but proving she could have if she'd wanted to. It was over in minutes, both of them breathing hard as they circled to a stop. He hadn't defeated her, but she hadn't tried to defeat him either. It had been a test, a demonstration of mutual capability and respect. They shifted back to human form in silence, the air between them charged with something more complex than simple attraction. There was recognition there, the acknowledgement of equals meeting for the first time. "Impressive," he said, genuinely meaning it. "Tormund taught you well. He said you'd appreciate proper technique over brute force." She was breathing hard but controlled, professional even in the aftermath of their encounter. "What exactly are you asking of me, Vera Nightfall?" "Training. Information exchange. A mutually beneficial arrangement." Her pale eyes met his steadily. "I know things about rogue movements in the Southern Territories that could help protect your lands. In return, I need to learn things that only an alpha of your caliber can teach, such as pack dynamics, political maneuvering, the kind of strategic thinking that wins wars rather than just battles." It was a reasonable request, but something in her tone suggested layers beneath the surface. This wasn't just about becoming a better fighter, or even a better leader. This was about preparation for something specific, something that required skills far beyond what Tormund could have taught her. "And after you've learned what you need to know?" he asked carefully. For the first time since he'd found her, her composure cracked slightly. Pain and determination warred in her expression before she regained control. "Then I reclaim what was stolen from me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and threat. Whatever had been taken from this woman, she intended to take it back with interest. And if the royal markings he'd glimpsed were authentic, she might actually have the power to do it. Cain made his decision with the swift calculation that had kept his pack alive through countless conflicts. This woman was dangerous, certainly, but she was also potentially the most valuable ally he could hope to find. "1 week," he said finally. "Prove to me that your information is worth my time, and we'll discuss terms." Something that might have been relief flickered across her features. "Agreed. Fair warning, though." He stepped closer, letting his alpha presence flare one more time. "If you're lying to me, if this is some elaborate trap, I will end you myself." She met his intensity without flinching. "I wouldn't expect anything less." As they stared at each other in the gathering dusk, both recognized they'd just initiated something that would change everything. The game had begun. Chapter 3. Earned Respect. The arrangement proved more complex than either of them had anticipated. Vera had expected Kane to house her in the pack's guest quarters, maintaining professional distance while they conducted their business. Instead, he'd assigned her a cabin on the outskirts of his personal territory, close enough for daily training sessions, far enough to avoid pack politics. "My wolves don't need to know the details of our arrangement," he'd explained, as he showed her the modest but well-appointed space. "They see a rogue being granted temporary sanctuary. Nothing more." Smart politics, she'd acknowledged silently. It protected both of them from questions neither was ready to answer. The intelligence exchange had begun immediately. Vera's 3 years in the neutral territories had given her unprecedented insight into rogue movements, territory disputes, and the growing unrest in the southern packs. Information that made Kane's expression increasingly grim. "You're telling me there are coordinated attacks happening across 5 different territories?" He studied the hand-drawn map she'd spread across his desk, marking locations and dates with military precision. "Not random violence," she confirmed, pointing to a cluster of incidents near the southern borders. "These strikes are too well organized, too strategic. Someone is testing defenses, probing for weaknesses, building intelligence for a larger assault. That's my assessment." She traced movement patterns with her finger. "The rogues I eliminated yesterday were scouts, not raiders. They were mapping your southern approaches." Kane's jaw tightened. "How long do we have? Based on the escalation pattern, 6 months, maybe less, before they move from reconnaissance to actual warfare." The information was valuable enough that he'd agreed to her training request without further negotiation. What he hadn't expected was discovering just how much she already knew. Their first session had been a disaster. For his ego, he'd assumed he'd be teaching basic combat techniques to someone with raw talent, but limited experience. Instead, Vera had demonstrated fighting skills that rivaled his most elite warriors. Her technique was flawless, her tactical understanding sophisticated, her physical conditioning exceptional. Tormund was thorough, she'd said dryly after disarming him for the 3rd time in their weapons practice. Apparently. He'd rubbed his wrist where she'd applied a pressure point he'd only seen used by military specialists. "What exactly did he teach you?" "Everything he knew about warfare, pack dynamics, and the old codes. He said I'd need every advantage I could get." "For what?" She'd deflected the question. But her evasion told him more than a direct answer might have. This woman was preparing for something specific, something that required skills far beyond those of a typical rogue or even a pack warrior. The breakthrough had come during their 4th session, when he'd decided to test her reflexes with unpredictable attack patterns. He'd moved faster than any normal wolf could track, using alpha speed and strength to push her beyond her apparent limits. That's when something extraordinary happened. Just before each of his attacks landed, her eyes would flash with that strange inner light he'd noticed during their first meeting. She'd twist away from strikes that should have been impossible to avoid, counterattack openings that hadn't fully developed yet, respond to threats that existed only in his intentions. She was reading his mind. Not his thoughts exactly, but his combat intentions, his tactical decisions, the micro-expressions that telegraphed his next move. It was an ability he'd read about in the oldest texts, a skill supposedly possessed by the legendary Alpha Kings who'd ruled their people through wisdom as much as strength. "Where did you learn that?" he'd asked, after she'd anticipated a particularly complex combination attack. "Learn what?" But her confusion seemed genuine, as if she wasn't fully aware of what she was doing. "You're reading my combat intentions before I fully form them." "That's not a technique, Vera. That's a gift." She'd gone very still. "Tormund said I had good instincts. This is beyond instincts. This is the kind of ability that made the old royal bloodline so effective as leaders. They could sense deception, anticipate threats, understand their people's needs before they were even expressed." The haunted look that crossed her face told him he'd hit close to something important. The royal lines died out generations ago. Did they? He'd studied her carefully, noting the way she avoided his eyes, Or were they just driven underground? She'd ended the session abruptly, claiming fatigue, but he'd seen the truth in her reaction. Whatever her background, it was connected to the old bloodlines in ways she wasn't ready to discuss. Their professional arrangement had shifted into something more personal 3 days later, during what should have been a routine patrol. His border scouts had reported unusual activity near the eastern farms. Livestock missing, strange scents, signs of organized intrusion. Kane had decided to investigate personally, bringing Vera along to demonstrate pack territory management in practice. They'd found the Hendricks family farm under attack. 5 rogues had cornered the human family in their barn, clearly intending to eliminate witnesses after stealing what they could carry. It was exactly the kind of escalating violence Vera had warned him about. Rogues growing bolder, more willing to risk exposure. The fight had been brutal, but brief. Kane and Vera had moved together with the kind of seamless coordination that typically took years to develop, each covering the other's weaknesses while maximizing their individual strengths. But it was what happened after the threat was eliminated that changed everything. While Kane had been securing the perimeter and checking for additional hostiles, Vera had knelt beside the terrified family. The Hendricks had 3 young children, all crying and traumatized by the violence they'd witnessed. "It's over now," she'd murmured to the youngest, a girl who couldn't have been more than 5. "The bad wolves are gone, and you're safe." Her voice had carried a warmth and authority that seemed to calm not just the children, but their parents as well. She'd helped them check their property for damage, offered practical advice about improving their security, even used some basic first aid training to treat minor injuries. Watching her interact with the family, Kane had seen past the deadly warrior to something else entirely. The natural Luna she must have been before whatever tragedy had driven her into exile. "You're good with them," he'd observed as they'd walked back toward pack territory. "I used to help with pack families regularly." Her voice had carried old pain. "Children have always been important to me. You'd make an excellent Luna." She'd flinched as if he'd struck her. "That's not possible for me anymore. Because of whatever happened in your past? Because some things can't be undone." But then, perhaps recognizing that her walls were showing cracks, she'd added, "Thank you for including me in that response. It felt good to help people again. It's what leaders do. Protect those who can't protect themselves. Is that how you see your role as alpha? Protection rather than dominance? The old codes teach that true strength comes from service, not power over others." He'd glanced at her sideways. "I suspect you understand that better than most." They'd walked in comfortable silence after that, both recognizing they'd shared something important without putting it into words. That evening, as they'd reviewed the day's events over a simple dinner, Kane had made a decision that surprised them both. "I know you're someone important running from something," he'd said without preamble. "I can see it in the way you move, the way you think, the skills you possess. You're not just any rogue, Vera Nightfall." She'd tensed, ready to deflect or deny. "But I'm not going to press for details you're not ready to share." His tone had been matter-of-fact, professional. "Everyone has secrets. What matters to me is who you are now, and what you're willing to contribute to our mutual goals." The relief in her expression had been unmistakable. "Thank you. However," he'd continued, "if the time comes when your past catches up to you, I expect honesty. I won't be blindsided by threats I could have prepared for." "Understood." "Good." He'd raised his glass of wine in a mock toast. "To profitable partnerships and mutual respect." "To earned trust," she'd countered, meeting his gesture with her own glass. As they'd shared the simple meal, both had recognized they'd moved beyond their original transactional arrangement into something resembling actual partnership. Maybe even friendship. Neither was ready to acknowledge the undercurrent of attraction that had been growing stronger with each passing day. But it was there nonetheless, in the way their eyes met and held during conversations, in the careful distance they maintained to avoid accidental contact, in the hyper-awareness each felt of the other's presence. For now, mutual respect and growing trust would be enough. The rest could wait until they were both ready to face what it might mean. The training would continue. The intelligence sharing would deepen, and whatever was building between them would develop in its own time, at its own pace. After all, the best partnerships were built on foundations of understanding. not rushed into based on immediate attraction. Time would tell what they were truly building together. Chapter 4. Breaking Walls. 3 weeks of intensive training had created an intimacy neither of them had expected. It started with small things. The way Kane would steady her elbow when she was learning a particularly complex, disarming technique. How Vera would unconsciously brush dust from his shoulder after their sparring sessions. Shared glances that lingered a fraction too long. Conversations that continued well past their scheduled training time. The professional boundaries they'd established were eroding, replaced by something warmer and far more dangerous. "Your stance is too rigid," Kane murmured, moving behind her to adjust her position for the advanced knife defense he'd been teaching. His hands settled on her hips, guiding her into proper alignment. "You're thinking too much about the technique instead of feeling the flow." Vera's breath caught as his chest pressed against her back, his body heat seeping through the thin fabric of her training shirt. For a moment, she forgot entirely about weapons and defense, her awareness narrowing to the solid strength of his presence. "Better," he said softly, seemingly unaware of how his proximity affected her. "Now, when I attack, don't anticipate. React." The blade came at her in a controlled arc, and this time her body responded without conscious thought. She flowed away from the strike, caught his wrist, and used his momentum to send him stumbling past her. The move was perfect, instinctual. "Excellent." His approval sent warmth spreading through her chest. "You're starting to trust your instincts instead of overthinking every response. Tormund always said I thought too much," she admitted, wiping sweat from her forehead. "He used to make me fight blindfolded to force me to rely on other senses." "Smart man." Kane retrieved the practice blade, but instead of immediately starting another drill, he studied her face. "You loved him, like the father I never really had." The admission surprised her with its honesty. She rarely spoke about personal feelings, but something about Kane's steady attention made the words come easier. "He saved my life in more ways than one. Tell me." She hesitated, then found herself speaking about the darkest period of her life. Not the details, not yet, but the broad strokes. A mate who'd betrayed her trust. A rejection that had cost her everything. The years of exile and the slow process of rebuilding herself into something stronger. "He sounds like he was afraid of your strength," Kane observed when she'd finished the carefully edited version of her story. Garrett was afraid of a lot of things. Bitterness crept into her voice. Change, uncertainty, anything that might challenge his authority. In the end, his fear destroyed both of us. His loss was the world's gain. She looked up, startled by the intensity in his voice. "Kane, I mean it." He stepped closer, silver eyes holding hers with unmistakable sincerity. "Whatever he lost when he let you go, it made you into the woman standing here now. Strong, capable, honorable. His stupidity is my good fortune." Heat flared between them, the air suddenly charged with possibility. For a moment, Vera thought he might kiss her, and she wasn't sure she'd have the willpower to stop him. Instead, he stepped back, breaking the moment with visible effort. "We should continue with the lesson." The next few days brought disturbing news from his border scouts. Movement in the southern territories had intensified dramatically. Not random rogue activity anymore, but organized military preparation. "They're mobilizing entire packs," Marcus, Kane's head scout, reported during their evening briefing. "Silvermoon has called in favors from at least 6 allied territories. This isn't raiding preparation, Alpha. This is preparation for war." Vera felt ice form in her stomach at the mention of her ex-mate's pack. "What kind of numbers are we talking about? Conservative estimate? 300 warriors, possibly more. They're establishing supply lines, setting up command posts, coordinating communications." Marcus's expression was grim. "Whatever they're planning, it's big." Kane studied the maps with tactical precision. "Targets? Unknown. But the positioning suggests they're preparing to move north." After Marcus left, Vera and Kane sat in heavy silence, the implications hanging between them like a storm cloud. "This is about more than territory," Kane said finally. "No Alpha commits this level of resources without existential motivation." Vera's mind raced, pieces of a puzzle she'd been avoiding suddenly clicking together. "There's something you need to know about the old bloodlines." She told him about the prophecy, Ancient words that spoke of a time when the true Alpha Queen would awaken, and 3 moons of war would decide the future of all werewolf territories. Words that had been whispered in pack circles for generations, dismissed as myth by most modern wolves. Garrett's grandmother was a keeper of the old stories, she explained. If he believes the prophecy is coming true, if he thinks someone with royal blood is about to challenge the current order, he'd do everything in his power to prevent it. Kane's expression was thoughtful. Even if it meant starting a war, especially if it meant starting a war. He'd rather burn everything down than risk losing control. They spent the next hour analyzing possibilities, discussing defensive strategies, planning for contingencies. But beneath the tactical considerations, both were aware of the personal implications. If Garrett was indeed preparing for war, it was only a matter of time before he discovered where Vera was hiding. The breakthrough in their relationship came 3 nights later, after successful coordination with 2 neighboring packs had secured critical alliance agreements. The negotiations had been delicate, requiring all of Kane's diplomatic skill and several demonstrations of Vera's strategic insights. To successful partnerships, Kane raised his glass of wine as they shared a quiet celebration in his private study. The formal negotiations were complete, but the real work of alliance building was just beginning. To mutual respect, Vera countered, echoing their first dinner together weeks ago. But this time, when their eyes met over the wine glasses, neither looked away. The attraction that had been building between them finally demanded acknowledgement. "Vera," he said softly, setting down his glass and moving closer. "I need you to know that this isn't just professional anymore. Not for me. Kane, I'm not asking for promises you're not ready to make." He cupped her face gently, thumb tracing her cheekbone. "I'm just asking for honesty. Do you feel what I feel?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility and risk. Vera's logical mind screamed warnings about complications, about the dangers of emotional entanglement, about the many reasons this was a terrible idea. But her heart, silent for so long, finally had something to say. "Yes," she whispered, "but I'm terrified of it. So am I." When he kissed her, it was with a tenderness that made her chest ache. Nothing demanding or possessive, just a careful exploration of possibilities. She melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, her body remembering what it felt like to be cherished rather than claimed. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I'm not ready for a mate bond," she said carefully, needing to establish boundaries before her resolve weakened further. "I know." He pressed his forehead against hers. "We'll take this as slowly as you need. And when my past catches up to me, we'll face it together." The promise wrapped around her heart like armor, protective and strengthening. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she deserved something good in her life. The moment was shattered by rapid knocking on the study door. "Alpha!" Marcus's voice carried urgency that made both of them tense. "Priority message from the southern border." Kane opened the door to reveal his head scout holding an official messenger's tube, the kind used for formal pack communications. The wax seal bore a symbol that made Vera's blood run cold, the silver moon crest of the Silver Moon Pack. "It's addressed to both of you," Marcus said quietly. With steady hands, Kane broke the seal and unrolled the parchment. As he read, his expression grew darker with each line. "What does it say?" Vera asked, though part of her already knew. Kane's voice was carefully controlled as he read aloud. "To Alpha Kane Stormcrest, and the rogue known as Vera Nightfall, you are harboring stolen property of the Silver Moon Pack. Return what belongs to me peacefully, and past transgressions will be forgiven. Refuse, and I will consider it an act of war against my territory and allies. You have until the next new moon to comply. 7 days. Alpha Garrett Silvermoon." The silence that followed was deafening. Vera felt the walls she'd spent years building around her heart crack under the weight of inevitability. Her past hadn't just caught up to her. It was about to destroy everything she'd begun to hope for. "Well," she said with forced lightness, "I suppose our honeymoon period is over." Kane folded the message with deliberate precision. "He can try to take you, but he'll have to go through me first." Chapter 5. Truth and Consequences. The revelation came at dawn, delivered by a messenger Vera hadn't expected to see again. She was practicing her morning sword forms when the familiar figure emerged from the tree line. Jonas, one of Tormund's old contacts, a grizzled tracker who'd helped coordinate her mercenary contracts over the past year. Miss Vera. He approached with the cautious respect reserved for dangerous allies. Got something for you from the old man. Said to give it to you if things ever went sideways with Silvermoon. He handed her a leather satchel she'd never seen before, sealed with Tormund's personal mark. He left this with me 2 months back, just before the end. Inside were documents that changed everything she thought she knew about her situation. Tormund's journals, detailed correspondence, and most shocking of all, a letter addressed to Kane Stormcrest, dated 3 months ago. Her hands trembled as she read her mentor's careful script. By the time you receive this, I'll likely be dead, and Vera will be seeking your protection. She doesn't know I'm writing this, but circumstances require preparation. She is the last direct descendant of the Nightfall royal line, and her awakening threatens to destabilize the entire continental power structure. You knew. She found Kane in his study, the letter clutched in her white-knuckled grip. You've known who I am this entire time. He didn't deny it, didn't try to deflect. Tormund contacted me before he died. He knew Garrett would eventually track you down, and he wanted to ensure you had allies when that happened. So this was all calculated? The training, the partnership, everything? The alliance was strategic, he admitted carefully. But everything else? What's growing between us? That was never part of any plan. Vera sank into the chair across from his desk, overwhelmed by the implications. What else don't I know? Kane retrieved a thick folder from his secure files. Tormund was thorough in his intelligence gathering. Your situation is more complex than either of us realized. The documents painted a picture that made her stomach clench with dread. Garrett's recent aggression wasn't just about reclaiming his former mate. It was about preventing a continental shift in werewolf politics. Other descendants are awakening, Kane explained, pointing to reports from across the territories. A she-wolf in the eastern coastal packs, who can command loyalty through pure charisma. Twin brothers in the mountain territories whose strategic thinking is reshaping entire alliances. The old bloodlines aren't extinct, Vera. They're resurging, and Garrett sees this as a threat to his authority, to the entire current system. Alphas like him rule through intimidation and brute force. If legitimate royal leadership emerges, their model of governance becomes obsolete. More disturbing still were the details about her poisoning. According to Tormund's research, Garrett hadn't acted alone. He'd made contact with the Covenant of Shadows, descendants of the wolves who'd orchestrated the original purge of royal bloodlines centuries ago. They gave him the suppressor formula, Vera read aloud from one of the documents. Not just to block my abilities, but to ensure they could never fully manifest. There's more. The final revelation hit her like a physical blow. Isadora's involvement hadn't been simple sisterly loyalty. She carried royal blood herself, a distant branch of the Silvermoon lineage that connected to the old monarchy. But instead of embracing her heritage, she'd chosen to serve the system that oppressed it. She was afraid, Kane said quietly. Afraid of the responsibility, the danger, the expectations that would come with revealing her true nature. So she helped destroy the one person who might have shown her another path. Vera felt pieces of her past reorganizing themselves into a new, more painful picture. She didn't just help poison me. She convinced Garrett to do it in the first place. According to Tormund's sources, yes. The sound of hoofbeats outside interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Vera could see a large party approaching. Too organized to be friendly visitors, too small to be an invasion force. Negotiation party, Kane observed grimly. He's making good on his threat. They watched from the study windows as 20 riders entered the main courtyard. Garrett rode at their center, his presence as commanding as ever. Flanked by his sister and several wolves Vera recognized as his inner circle. But it was the additional figures that made her blood run cold. Mercenaries, by their gear and bearing. Professional fighters who owed no loyalty to pack law or tradition. He brought hired killers to a diplomatic meeting, she murmured. He's not here for diplomacy. Marcus appeared at the study door. Alpha, they're requesting formal parley. Garrett Silvermoon wishes to speak with you and... He hesitated. The stolen property he's come to reclaim. Kane's jaw tightened. Tell him we'll meet in 1 hour. Neutral ground, the ceremonial circle. Standard parley rules, 5 representatives each, no weapons. After Marcus left, Vera stood quietly for several minutes, processing the magnitude of her situation. Everything she'd built here, every connection she'd formed, was about to be destroyed by the consequences of decisions made years ago. I won't let him start a war over me, she said finally. Vera, no. Her voice carried new resolve. Look at what he brought, Kane. Mercenaries, warriors who don't care about pack law or civilian casualties. If I refuse to go with him, he'll burn your territory to find me. He'll kill your people to make a point. Then we fight. With what? Even with your alliances, you're outnumbered 3-1. And that's assuming the other northern packs will risk their own territories for a rogue they barely know. The truth of it hung between them like a blade. Kane's tactical mind was already calculating odds, considering strategies, weighing costs. She could see him reaching the same conclusion she had. There's another option, she said quietly. I'm listening. Ancient law. If Garrett wants to claim me as stolen property, I can invoke the right of challenge. Single combat, winner takes all. Kane shook his head immediately. He's stronger than you, Vera. More experienced in alpha-level combat. You'd be fighting at a disadvantage. Not if I stop holding back. She met his eyes steadily. The suppressor effects have been weakening for months. I can feel my abilities trying to resurface. In a life-or-death situation, fighting for my freedom, they might break through completely. And if they don't, then you lead the Northern Alliance against whatever comes next. With or without me, the old bloodlines are awakening. Someone needs to be ready to guide them. The parley took place as scheduled, both parties maintaining the formal protocols, even though everyone present understood they were discussing war. Garrett looked exactly as Vera remembered. Handsome, confident, radiating the kind of casual dominance that had once attracted her. Now it just made her skin crawl. Vera. His voice carried false warmth. You look well. Exile seems to have agreed with you. What do you want, Garrett? What's mine? You're my former mate, which makes you my responsibility. This vacation you've been taking ends now. I was never your property. That's where you're wrong. His smile turned cold. You carry something that belongs to my bloodline. Something that was stolen when you fled. I'm simply reclaiming it. My abilities were never yours to control, weren't they? Isadora stepped forward, her expression smug. Who do you think helped awaken them in the first place? The training exercises, the meditation techniques, the careful cultivation of your episodes? That was all my guidance, sister dear. I made you what you are. The casual revelation hit Vera like ice water. You manipulated me. I prepared you. There's a difference. We needed to understand the extent of your capabilities before deciding how to handle them. And you decided to destroy them. I decided to preserve the natural order. Isadora's voice carried absolute conviction. The royal bloodlines fell for good reason. They were too powerful, too destabilizing. Better to have order under strong alphas than chaos under mystical queens. Vera felt something crack open inside her chest. Not heartbreak, but rage. Pure, crystalline fury at the years of manipulation. The stolen child. The carefully orchestrated destruction of everything she might have been. You want what's yours? She said to Garrett, her voice deadly calm. Then take it. Single combat. Ancient law. If you can defeat me fairly, I'll return to your pack willingly. And if you win, then you acknowledge my right to freedom and never threaten my allies again. Garrett's eyes gleamed with anticipation. Accepted. Tomorrow night, during the dark moon. Neutral territory. As the parley dissolved and both parties prepared for what was to come, Vera felt the suppressed powers stirring in her blood like awakening fire. Tomorrow night would determine whether she reclaimed her birthright or died trying. But either way, she would finally be free of Garrett Silvermoon's control. The true battle for her destiny was starting now. Chapter 6. The Queen's Gambit. The ancient dueling grounds lay in the heart of neutral territory, a circular clearing surrounded by standing stones that predated any living memory. Moonlight filtered through the canopy above, casting ethereal patterns across the ritual space where werewolf law had been settled for millennia. Vera stood at the eastern edge of the circle, feeling the weight of history pressing down upon her. This was where her ancestors had once resolved disputes with honor rather than massacre, where strength had been measured by more than brute force alone. Tonight, she would either reclaim that legacy or die trying. Nervous? Kane's voice was carefully neutral, but she could feel the tension radiating from him like heat. Terrified, she admitted honestly, but ready. He'd wanted to stand as her second, to be present for whatever support the ancient laws allowed. She'd refused, knowing that Garrett would interpret any sign of backup as weakness to exploit. The suppressor effects are almost gone, she continued, flexing her fingers and feeling power stirring beneath her skin like electricity. I can sense things I haven't felt in years. The emotional states of every wolf within 100 yards, the life force of the forest around us, the very pulse of the earth itself. Can you control it? I'm about to find out. Across the clearing, Garrett was conducting his own preparations, stretching muscles and conferring quietly with Isadora. He looked confident, relaxed even. Why shouldn't he? On paper, this fight was heavily weighted in his favor. He was older, more experienced, physically larger and stronger. He'd been training for alpha combat his entire life, while her formal education had been interrupted by years of exile. In any conventional match, he would dominate completely. But this wasn't going to be a conventional match. The neutral arbiter, an ancient she-wolf whose pack allegiance was to the old laws, rather than any current territory, called the combatants forward. Her voice carried the authority of centuries. Ancient law governs this circle. Single combat between Garrett Silvermoon and Vera Nightfall. Winner claims disputed rights. No weapons, no assistance, no mercy. Fight until one yields, flees, or dies. She raised a gnarled hand toward the dark sky. By moon and star, by stone and bone, let justice be done. The formal words released something primal in the clearing, as if the very ground awakened to witness what was about to unfold. Garrett stepped forward with predatory grace, already beginning his transformation. Last chance to surrender, Vera. Come home willingly, and I'll be merciful. I am home, she replied, her own shift beginning. And mercy is something you'll need, not something you'll grant. The transformations were as different as the wolves themselves. Garrett's was explosive, violent, bones cracking like gunshots as his massive dark brown wolf erupted into existence. He was built like a battering ram, all muscle and aggression and intimidating size. Vera's change was fluid, controlled, like water taking a new shape. Her wolf emerged with predatory elegance, smaller than his but perfectly proportioned, white fur gleaming like starlight in the darkness. But it was the markings that made the gathered witnesses gasp. Silver patterns traced her muzzle and throat, ancient symbols that hadn't been seen in living memory. The genetic markers of royal bloodline, visible now that the suppressor's influence was finally breaking down. They circled each other warily, both recognizing that the first exchange would set the tone for everything that followed. Garrett struck first, using his size advantage to attempt an overwhelming assault. He was fast despite his bulk, jaws snapping toward her throat with killing force. But Vera wasn't there when his teeth closed. She'd read his intention in the micro-expressions that preceded the attack, flowing away from the strike and countering with surgical precision. Her claws raked across his shoulder, drawing blood, but avoiding permanent damage. A warning, not a killing blow. The pattern continued for several exchanges. Garrett's attacks were powerful but predictable, telegraphed by a lifetime of relying on strength over strategy. Vera danced around him like mist, landing precise strikes that accumulated damage without creating decisive advantage. But she could feel her abilities strengthening with each passing moment. The suppressor's final restraints were dissolving under the pressure of mortal combat, releasing powers that had been locked away for 3 years. Suddenly, she could feel not just Garrett's physical intentions, but his emotional state, the growing frustration as his attacks failed to connect. The bewilderment as techniques that had always worked proved ineffective. The first stirrings of fear as he realized this fight wasn't going according to plan. That's when she decided to stop holding back. The next time Garrett lunged, Vera didn't dodge. Instead, she met his charge head-on, her smaller frame somehow absorbing the impact and redirecting his momentum. Ancient combat techniques passed down through bloodlines that knew how to turn an enemy's strength against them. Garrett hit the ground hard, rolling to avoid her counterattack. When he regained his feet, his eyes showed the first real uncertainty she'd seen from him in years. "What are you?" he snarled, words barely comprehensible through his wolf form. "What I always was," she replied, her own voice carrying new harmonics that seemed to resonate with the very stones around them. "What you tried to destroy." The real fight began then. Not the careful testing of the opening minutes, but a savage exchange of everything both wolves possessed. Garrett abandoned tactics in favor of pure aggression, trying to overwhelm her through sheer violence. It was exactly the wrong approach. With each brutal exchange, Vera felt more of her true nature awakening. She began anticipating his moves not seconds but minutes before he made them, reading the flow of combat like text on a page. Her strikes became more precise, more devastating, targeting pressure points and vulnerabilities with surgical accuracy. But more than that, she could feel the presence of every wolf watching the fight. Their emotions, their loyalties, their growing recognition of what they were witnessing. Some of Garrett's own warriors were beginning to doubt their alpha's righteousness. The turning point came when Garrett, desperate and increasingly erratic, attempted a killing blow aimed at her spine. It was a dishonorable move, intended to cripple rather than defeat cleanly. Vera saw it coming long before he committed to the attack. But instead of simply avoiding it, she made a choice that changed everything. She consciously, deliberately shattered the last restraints holding back her royal bloodline. The transformation was agonizing and beautiful simultaneously. Power flooded through her like liquid lightning, awakening abilities that had slumbered for generations. Her white fur began to gleam with inner light, the silver markings expanding and deepening until they covered her entire form in patterns of ancient authority. But most dramatically, her size began to increase. Not the bulky mass that characterized most alpha transformations, but a refined expansion that maintained her elegant proportions while adding the physical presence necessary for true dominance. When the change completed, she stood nearly as large as Garrett, but with a presence that dwarfed his completely. Every wolf in the clearing felt it. The return of something that had been missing from their world for too long. True royal authority. Garrett's final attack met empty air as Vera seemed to simply phase through his assault. When she materialized behind him, one paw pressed against his throat, with just enough pressure to make breathing difficult. "Yield," she commanded, her voice carrying harmonics that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to his wolf's survival instincts. For a moment, she thought he might actually surrender. His body language showed submission, his wolf recognizing the presence of a superior predator. But Isadora's voice cut through the clearing like a blade. "Fight, you fool! She's still just a broken Luna playing at being something she's not." The insult shattered whatever control Vera had maintained over her awakening abilities. Rage flooded through her, not the hot anger of personal offense, but the cold fury of insulted majesty. Her response was swift and decisive. Instead of the killing blow Garrett's dishonor deserved, she did something far more devastating to an alpha's pride. She dominated him completely, using abilities that had been theoretical until this moment. Vera projected her authority directly into Garrett's mind, not a physical assault, but a psychic demonstration of exactly how far beneath her he truly ranked. The effect was immediate and absolute. Garrett's wolf collapsed, whimpering, every instinct screaming that he was in the presence of a superior who could destroy him with a thought. "I could kill you," she said conversationally, her voice carrying to every corner of the clearing. "Ancient law would support it. You broke faith with your Luna, attempted to suppress royal bloodline, brought dishonor to the sacred bonds of mateship." She leaned closer, her muzzle near his ear. "But death would be merciful. Instead, you'll live with the knowledge that when you had the chance to serve something greater than yourself, you chose fear and jealousy instead." "War." The formal words of victory came naturally, as if she'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. By ancient law and blood right, I claim victory in this combat. Garrett Silvermoon, you are stripped of alpha authority and banned from leadership over any werewolf pack. Your warriors may choose new allegiance or face the consequences of following a dishonored alpha. The clearing erupted in stunned silence, then gradually building murmurs as the implications sank in. Vera had won. But more than that, she had revealed herself as something none of them had expected to see in their lifetime. A true alpha queen, awakened at last. The legends were real. The royal bloodlines lived, and everything was about to change. Chapter 7. Crown of Stars. The aftermath of the duel unfolded with surprising swiftness. Within hours of Vera's victory, delegations from 3 of Garrett's allied packs had arrived at the neutral grounds, their leaders requesting formal audience with the newly revealed Alpha Queen. The ancient laws were clear. When royal bloodline emerged through legitimate challenge, existing alliances could be renegotiated without dishonor. Your Majesty? The title still felt strange on Vera's tongue when others used it, but she was learning to accept the weight of what she'd become. Marcus Ironwood, Alpha of the Redstone Pack, knelt before her with genuine respect. My pack pledges loyalty to the rightful queen. We renounce our previous alliance with the disgraced Silvermoon leadership. 2 other pack leaders echoed similar sentiments, their warriors already displaying new allegiance markers. It was politically expedient, certainly, but Vera could sense their genuine relief at having legitimate royal authority to serve. The greater challenge came from those who hadn't witnessed her transformation firsthand. Proof, demanded Helena Blackthorn, Alpha of the Eastern Reaches, when messengers brought word of the night's events. We've heard claims of royal awakening before. Show us abilities that justify such grand titles. Vera had expected skepticism. What she hadn't anticipated was how naturally her new powers would respond to the challenge. Standing in the great hall of Kane's territory, she extended her awareness across the assembled wolves. Not the invasive mental intrusion that would violate their privacy, but the gentle touch of royal bloodline recognizing its people. Helena, she said softly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room despite its quiet tone. You're testing me because your grandmother told stories of false queens who brought disaster to the Eastern Territories. Your skepticism honors her memory. Helena's eyes widened with shock. How could you possibly know about my grandmother's warnings? Because I can feel your emotions, your motivations, your genuine concern for your pack's welfare. That's not magic, Helena. That's what real leadership looks like. Understanding your people deeply enough to guide them wisely. She turned her attention to another doubter. Thomas, you're worried about the economic implications of changing alliances. Your pack depends on trade routes that Garrett's coalition controls. You need assurance that royal leadership won't abandon practical concerns for mystical idealism. One by one, she addressed the specific fears and concerns of every alpha present, demonstrating an understanding of their situations that went far beyond surface knowledge. It wasn't mind reading. It was the intuitive political awareness that had made the ancient royal bloodlines so effective. By evening, 12 packs had formally pledged allegiance to Queen Vera of the Northern Confederation. But personal victory felt hollow without resolution of what mattered most to her. The claiming ritual must wait for the full moon, Kane explained as they walked through his private gardens after the last delegation had departed. Ancient law requires specific conditions for royal bonding. 3 days, Vera mused, watching moonlight filter through the pine branches above them. Are you certain about this, Kane? Accepting the role of king consort means subordinating your own authority to mine. You'd be giving up independent leadership of your pack. Would I? His smile carried warmth she was still learning to accept. Or would I be gaining partnership with someone whose judgment I trust completely? They'd discussed the political implications extensively. As queen, Vera would need to govern multiple territories, coordinate complex alliances, and manage the delicate process of transitioning from the current system to something resembling the old royal structure. It was work that required a partner, not a subordinate. Besides, Kane continued, you've seen how I lead my pack. It's never been about dominance for its own sake. It's about service, protection, creating something worth preserving. Those goals don't change just because the scope gets larger. The scope gets much larger, she warned. I can feel other bloodlines awakening across the continent. What we're building here is just the beginning. Then we'd better make sure we build it right. The full moon ceremony took place in the ancient circle where her duel with Garrett had occurred, the sacred ground lending additional power to their union. Representatives from allied packs formed concentric circles around the central ritual space, bearing witness to a claiming unlike any in living memory. Traditional werewolf bonding focused on the connection between two individuals. Royal claiming was something broader, deeper, a union that linked not just hearts, but destinies, territories, and the welfare of all who served under their combined authority. By moon and star, by stone and bone, the ancient arbiter began, her voice carrying the weight of ritual performed since time immemorial. Two souls seek binding and service to pack and people. Vera stood in the center of the circle wearing ceremonial robes that had been hastily crafted in the royal colors, deep blue silk embroidered with silver thread that seemed to capture and hold moonlight. On her head rested a circlet of beaten silver inlaid with moonstones, a crown that had been commissioned specifically for this moment. Kane wore complementary ceremonial dress, midnight black leather decorated with silver studs that formed constellation patterns across his chest. His circlet was simpler but no less meaningful, marking him as chosen consort to royal bloodline. Vera Nightfall of the royal line, the arbiter continued. Do you accept Kane Stormcrest as your chosen mate and partner in leadership? I do. The words carried power that resonated through the gathered crowd. Not as subject to ruler, but as equal in purpose and dedication. Kane Stormcrest of the Northern Pack, do you accept Vera Nightfall as your queen and mate, pledging service to her crown and protection to her person? I do. His voice was steady, completely certain. In partnership, in purpose, in all things, until death separates us. The ritual exchange of vows was followed by the claiming itself, not the violent, possessive marking that characterized many werewolf bondings, but something gentler and infinitely more profound. When Kane's teeth pressed against the pulse point of her throat, Vera felt their souls connecting on levels she hadn't known existed. Not the desperate need of infatuation, but the deep recognition of spirits that complemented each other perfectly. Her own claiming mark on his throat was placed with similar reverence, sealing bonds that went far beyond physical attraction or political convenience. The power that flowed between them as the claiming completed was unlike anything either had experienced. Not the simple sharing of strength that normal mate bonds provided, but a complex weaving of abilities that amplified both partners. Vera's royal awareness expanded, now encompassing not just her own territories, but reaching toward lands she'd never seen. She could feel the stirring of other awakening bloodlines, the potential for alliances that might reshape the entire continent. But more importantly, she could feel Kane's tactical brilliance becoming available to her own decision-making processes. His years of experience in pack leadership, his understanding of military strategy, his deep knowledge of northern politics, all of it now accessible to enhance her own capabilities. For Kane, the bond brought access to abilities he'd only read about in ancient texts, the emotional awareness that let him truly understand his people's needs, the strategic vision that could see patterns and possibilities across vast spans of time and territory, the profound sense of rightness that came with serving something greater than personal ambition. By this claiming, the arbiter announced to the assembled witnesses, Queen Vera and King Consort Kane are bound in service to each other and to all who follow their banner. Let none separate what moon and magic have joined. The celebration that followed lasted until dawn, but the real work began immediately. Within a week, the practical implications of the new order became clear. Packs that had feuded for generations found themselves cooperating under royal mediation. Trade disputes that had threatened to explode into warfare were resolved through the Queen's intuitive understanding of each party's actual needs. Most significantly, the scattered reports of other awakening bloodlines began to coalesce into a larger pattern. The royal lines weren't returning in isolation. They were emerging in response to some continental shift that none of them fully understood yet. We're going to need a much larger administrative structure, Kane observed during one of their evening planning sessions. What we're building is starting to look less like an expanded pack and more like an actual kingdom. Good, Vera replied, studying maps that showed their expanding sphere of influence. Because that's exactly what it needs to be. 3 territories away, in a private estate that had once housed disgraced nobility, Isadora Silvermoon sat staring at reports of her brother's complete political collapse. The once mighty Silvermoon pack had fragmented completely, its former allies abandoning Garrett with the same speed they'd once sworn loyalty. Her own position was precarious, too closely associated with the old regime to be trusted by the new order, but too obviously of royal bloodline to be ignored indefinitely. "The game isn't over," she murmured to the empty room, her hand tracing patterns on a map that showed territories far from the Queen's current reach. "There are other players on the board, other bloodlines who might not be so forgiving. But for now, in the growing kingdom of the North, Queen Vera and King Cain worked side by side to build something that had been missing from their world for far too long. A government based on wisdom rather than fear, service rather than dominance, and the understanding that true strength came from lifting others up rather than keeping them down. The age of the Alpha Queen had begun. Chapter 8. Ever After. 18 months later, the transformation was complete. Queen Vera stood on the balcony of Stormcrest Castle, now officially renamed the royal seat of the Northern Confederation, watching the morning sun illuminate a kingdom that bore little resemblance to the fractured territories she'd inherited through conquest and claiming. The castle itself had been expanded and modernized, but carefully, preserving the ancient stones while adding the administrative wings necessary for governing multiple territories. The Great Hall now hosted the monthly Council of Alphas, where territorial disputes were resolved through mediation rather than warfare. Below in the courtyard, young wolves from a dozen different packs trained together under unified military standards. No longer did each territory maintain its own isolated fighting styles and competing philosophies. The Royal Guard represented the best of all traditions, woven together into something stronger than any single pack could achieve. "The morning reports, Your Majesty." Elena, her new chief administrator, approached with the leather portfolio that had become a daily ritual. The she-wolf had once served as Garrett's logistics coordinator, but had transferred her loyalty smoothly when it became clear the new order offered advancement based on competence rather than political connections. "Thank you, Elena." Vera accepted the documents, though her attention was partially occupied by the active stirring in her rounded belly. 6 months along now, and the pregnancy felt completely different from her first, tragic experience. This child was protected not just by her restored powers, but by an entire kingdom dedicated to ensuring royal succession. The morning briefings painted a picture of qualified success. Trade revenues were up 30%, with the standardized currency and unified tariff system eliminating the barriers that had previously fragmented northern commerce. The new judicial code, based on ancient royal law but adapted for modern circumstances, had resolved dozens of long-standing disputes without a single armed conflict. Most significantly, the refugee crisis that had plagued the region for years was finally under control. Displaced wolves from the southern territories' ongoing instability had found homes and purpose within the Confederation's expanding borders. "The delegation from the western reaches arrived this morning," Elena continued. "Alpha Morrison is prepared to discuss formal alliance terms. And the intelligence reports from the Scout Network? Mixed news, I'm afraid. The situation in the Eastern Territories continues to deteriorate. 3 more packs have requested refugee status, but we're already operating near capacity for new integrations." Vera nodded thoughtfully. Success brought its own challenges. The Confederation's reputation for stability and prosperity was attracting attention from across the continent, not all of it welcome. What about the other bloodline reports? Confirmed awakening in the southwestern desert clans. A young alpha named David Sandstorm, who's demonstrating tactical abilities similar to your own. His people are calling him the War Chief of Prophecy. Friend or potential rival? Unknown. He's been careful to avoid territorial expansion that might conflict with established powers, but his influence is growing rapidly. The reports continued for another hour, covering everything from crop yields to diplomatic overtures from territories so distant that Vera had only recently learned they existed. The scope of her responsibilities had expanded far beyond anything she'd imagined when she first crossed into Cain's territory seeking training. But it was work that felt natural, necessary, right in ways that her previous life as a traditional Luna never had. "Your Majesty?" Elena's voice interrupted her contemplation. "The King Consort requests your presence in the war room when you're available. Something about the Academy proposal." Vera smiled. the expression coming easily now in ways it hadn't for years. The Academy for Young Leaders had been Kane's brainchild, an institution that would train the next generation in the principles of royal leadership rather than simple alpha dominance. She found him bent over architectural plans, his dark hair falling across his forehead, in a way that still made her heart skip despite their months of marriage. The claiming bond had only strengthened over time, their partnership evolving into something deeper and more complex than either had expected. "The construction timeline looks feasible," he said without looking up, somehow sensing her presence before she spoke. "We could break ground next spring, have the first classes enrolled within 2 years, assuming the council approves the funding. They will. Half of them are already asking about enrollment for their own children." Vera moved to stand beside him, studying the elaborate plans for a complex that would house students from across the continent. Not just the children of pack leaders, but promising youngsters from every social level, selected for potential rather than hereditary privilege. "You realize this is going to change everything," she said softly. "Training leaders who understand cooperation over competition, service over dominance. In a generation, the entire continental power structure could be transformed. That's the idea." Kane straightened, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his hands settling protectively over her pregnant belly. "Though I suspect our daughter will have her own ideas about how things should be run." Their daughter. Magic had revealed a healthy female child who seemed to be developing with the genetic markers of both parents, Kane's tactical brilliance and Vera's royal awareness. A future queen who would inherit a kingdom far different from the fractured territories her mother had known. "Have you given more thought to names?" Kane asked, his voice carrying the gentle teasing that had become common between them. "Luna," Vera replied without hesitation, "for the title I once held and lost, but also for the future she'll help create. Luna Stormcrest Nightfall. It has a ring to it." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching through the windows as their kingdom went about its daily business. Below in the courtyard, young wolves sparred under the guidance of instructors who emphasized honor over brutality. In the administrative wings, diplomats from a dozen territories worked to resolve conflicts through negotiation rather than warfare. But not everything was perfect. The reports Elena had shared that morning highlighted challenges that would require careful management in the years ahead. The Confederation's rapid growth had attracted refugees faster than they could be properly integrated. Some established packs remained suspicious of royal authority, preferring the familiar chaos of the old system to the structured cooperation the new order demanded. More concerning were the intelligence reports from distant territories. Other bloodlines were indeed awakening, but not all of them seemed inclined toward peaceful cooperation. There were rumors of a young queen in the far south who ruled through fear rather than wisdom, of twin princes in the mountain territories whose idea of royal prerogative involved conquest rather than service. "We're going to face challenges from other awakened bloodlines," Vera said quietly. "Not everyone who carries royal genetics is going to share our vision of what that power should be used for. Then we'll deal with those challenges when they arise," Kane replied calmly. "We've built something worth defending here, Vera. Our people know the difference between leadership that serves them and leadership that exploits them. That's going to matter when the time comes to choose sides." A soft knock interrupted their conversation. Marcus entered, his expression carrying the controlled excitement that meant significant news. "Your Majesties, priority message from the Southern Scout Network. You'll want to hear this personally." The message, when decoded, brought both hope and concern. Another confirmed royal awakening, this time in the coastal territories. A young woman named Sarah Wavecrest, who'd successfully united 3 previously hostile island packs through what witnesses described as impossible diplomatic wisdom. But more intriguingly, she'd sent formal greetings to Her Majesty Queen Vera of the Northern Confederation, along with a proposal for alliance between royal bloodlines committed to peaceful governance. "She's reaching out," Vera murmured, studying the carefully formal language of the proposal. "Building a network of awakened bloodlines who share similar values." "Smart politics," Kane agreed. "If we're facing opposition from less benevolent royal bloodlines, having allies who understand the true responsibilities of power becomes critical." They spent the remainder of the afternoon crafting a response that would open diplomatic channels without committing to anything beyond mutual recognition and information sharing. The political landscape was shifting too rapidly for grand gestures, but careful relationship building could lay the foundation for something significant. As evening approached, Vera found herself back on the royal balcony, this time accompanied by Kane as they shared their customary sunset review of the day's accomplishments and tomorrow's challenges. The kingdom spread below them was peaceful, prosperous, and secure in ways that had seemed impossible when she'd first stumbled across Stormcrest's borders as a broken exile seeking nothing more than survival. "Do you ever regret it?" Kane asked quietly. The complexity, the responsibility, the constant pressure of governing so many territories? Vera considered the question seriously, then shook her head. "Never. This is what I was meant to be, Kane. Not just a Luna supporting someone else's vision, but a queen creating something new." She placed her hand over his where it rested on her belly, feeling their daughter's active response to her father's presence. "She's going to inherit something better than either of us ever imagined possible. A world where strength serves wisdom instead of the other way around. A future worth fighting for." As the last light faded from the western sky and the first stars appeared overhead, Queen Vera Stormcrest Nightfall reflected on the journey that had brought her from abandonment to authority. From broken Luna to crowned queen, she had fallen as a Luna, but rose as a queen. And in her rising, she lifted all who followed. The age of royal bloodlines had returned, and the world would never be the same.